So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch break. And we were talking a lot about clean meat today and its potential, and that is one thing. But what about its public perception? That certainly is another thing. And our next talk will elaborate on that and is brought to you by Chris Bryant with the Bath University in the UK. He will give us a systematic review on the research on public perceptions of clean meat. This talk explores who the early adopters of clean meat might be, the importance of perceived benefits and barriers, and how messaging and naming shape public perceptions and the market for clean meat in various countries around the world. Please give a warm welcome on stage for Chris Bryant. There he is.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Okay, just checking my clicker works. Great to be here today. Thank you very much to ProVeg for inviting me here and for putting on this fantastic conference. It's been great so far. Thank you very much. Has everyone heard the exciting news in the plant-based world that there's going to be vegan options available at KFC? I saw this news this morning. This is good. This is good. An animal advocacy organization said, at KFC, the animals grow so large so quickly that they often collapse under their own body weight. And a spokesman from KFC responded saying, that's no way to talk about our customers. So I'm going to talk today about public perceptions of cultured meat. We'll be looking at some survey data, going over the perceived benefits and barriers to acceptance that consumers have. I'll talk a little bit about the nomenclature and the debate around naming that's often had with regards to clean meat. Look at some of the messaging strategies that can be used to maximize acceptance, and have a look at some data on clean meat acceptance in different countries around the world. So we'll start off looking at a range of surveys here. This is a bunch of different surveys that have been done. We can see in green the proportion of those which people are saying that they would eat it. In red, the proportion saying that they wouldn't eat it, and in yellow, the proportion who are unsure. As you can see, it varies a lot between different surveys. So this basically depends on how the product's described and what exactly the question is asked. You can see that the most pessimistic of these puts it at about 1 in 5 saying that they would eat it, and the most optimistic is more like 2/3 saying that they would eat it. So I go with the top one here if I'm speaking to journalists and investors, and I go with the bottom one when I'm trying to justify my funding. So they vary a lot, but there's some quite consistent patterns that we can see between different consumer groups. So here we've got a bunch of different studies along the bottom and different groups represented in the different bars on the chart. So we'll go through some of these things, and this is useful in identifying who are going to be the early adopters of clean meat. So as you can see here, we quite consistently see higher acceptance amongst men compared to women. There's a number of ideas about why that might be. Now, this can be seen as a good thing because men on average eat about 50% more meat than women. So by going after the male consumers, there's more potential to displace demand for conventional meat. Having said that, women are often making the food purchasing decisions on behalf of a family. Women are making the majority of food purchasing decisions in general, so convincing women that clean meat is a better idea than conventional meat should be a key aim for clean meat marketers. We can also see pretty consistently higher acceptance amongst younger consumers compared to older consumers. This can tell us something about who the first market will be and who should be the consumers that we're going after. It's thought that this is basically because younger people in general are more open to new ideas, new experiences. The older people get, the less openness they share, which is a personality trait in psychology and is well known to be lower in older people compared to younger people. We also see higher acceptance generally amongst left-leaning people compared to right-leaning people when we're talking about political views. Left-leaning people are typically, well, more likely to be vegetarian or vegan, first of all, more likely to have concern for the issues around this, and are more likely to recognize the benefits of clean meat compared to conventional meat production. Crucially, we see consistently higher acceptance amongst meat eaters compared to vegetarians and vegans. Most vegetarians and vegans are not interested in eating clean meat. So most people here, many people here will probably be in that category. Now, from our perspective, I think that this is basically a good thing. First of all, there are not very many vegetarians and vegans, so going after the meat eaters is a strategy where you're going after 95% of the market as opposed to 5% of the market. They're also already not contributing to the problems associated with conventional meat. There's really nothing to gain from getting vegetarians eating cultured meat. Really, all of the gains to be made are from displacing demand for conventional meat. So it's a good thing that we see in the data that the appeal is much higher for meat eaters. And it is also, the chap down here made a point earlier about cultured meat competing with plant-based meat. Interestingly, we see in the data that whilst clean meat is more appealing to heavier meat eaters, plant-based meat is more appealing to vegetarians, vegans, flexitarians, meat reducers. So it's likely that these two different products will be aimed at basically the two different sides of the market. One important trend that we see, and this is a very robust correlation that we see across a bunch of different data sets, is more familiarity means more acceptance. So people who are more familiar with the concept in general are much more likely to say that they would eat it. This, again, is basically to be expected. This is related to something in psychology called the mere exposure effect. People are more likely to have positive attitudes towards things that they're more familiar with in general. Even things arbitrary like shapes, if you've seen them before, you have a more positive attitude towards them. And we see that here with regards to cultured meat. Now, again, this is a good thing because it means that over time, it's likely that we're going to see acceptance of cultured meat overall go up as people become more familiar with it. We're still in a situation now where over 50% of consumers have actually never heard of it. So whatever acceptance rates we see in surveys at the moment, it's very likely that that will increase over time as people become more familiar with the product. So let's have a look at some of the benefits that consumers see with regards to clean meat. There are four main ones. Being kinder to animals is the most commonly recognized one. It's basically obvious from the nature of the thing that it's better than having to kill and eat animals. Being better for the environment, in particular greenhouse gases, this is something that consumers are particularly increasingly aware of with regards to conventional meat production. Helping to feed the world, people have an idea that this could increase our production capacity for meat, basically, and enable people in poorer parts of the world to eat meat who don't have access to conventional meat. And increasing food safety. Now, I should say that the top two here are basically the things that people get and are aware of already without really needing to be nudged. Whereas particularly potential benefits to food safety is very rarely recognized. So a few people bring this up with regards to being able to control zoonotic diseases, all sorts of diseases that come from meat consumption, animal product consumption. But basically, this is not something that most consumers think of, and I think there's room to do more to make consumers aware of that. So here we can see the results of an experiment where people were shown one of three different messages about clean meat. I know you can't really see the bottom of the screen here, so the green line here, this is before and after reading information. So the green line here is people who read about their health benefits, lower saturated fat, potential to replace it with omega-3 oils, etc. The red line here is people who read about the environmental benefits, and the blue line is people who read about the ethical benefits, both to animals and the potential to feed the world. You can see that reading about the health benefits resulted in the largest increase in positive attitudes, and worryingly, focus on the ethical benefits actually resulted in slightly less people saying that they would eat it than not reading about the benefits at all. So let's have a look at some of the barriers to acceptance now. What are the reasons why people might be put off eating cultured meat? Firstly, lots of people think that it will cost too much. This is probably true. Certainly initially it will be more expensive than conventional meat. And lots of people have read these headlines about Mark Post's €250,000 burger. That will be quite difficult to sell in McDonald's. Some people have the intuition that it won't taste as good or will be kind of texturally inferior. So sort of sensory aspects there. Some people, and these last two are perhaps the most important, have the intuition that it could be unsafe, and the related idea that it's unnatural. Basically, lots of people have this intuition that naturalness is a good thing, and if it's unnatural, that means that it could be unsafe, or could be bad for the environment, or that some people just think that naturalness is inherently valuable, and moving away from naturalness is a bad thing in and of itself. So, of these, the most important ones, or the most widely perceived ones, are to do with naturalness and food safety. So you can see here that around about 50% of consumers responded in a UK survey, saying they would worry about what chemicals or ingredients it contained, they'd worry about possible long-term side effects, and it's unnatural. You also have concerns about the taste and the price, affecting slightly less people. Now, with regards to taste and price, these are things that consumers will be able to verify for themselves. They can try it, they can see the price tag, they'll know whether this is an issue. With safety, it's a bit more complicated. You can't necessarily work that out for yourself by consuming it. Even if you've been consuming it for years, there might be some kind of health consequences that you don't know about. This is what they call a credence attribute. It's based on beliefs rather than observable characteristics. So this is a bit more difficult to contend with from a selling perspective. And it's likely that regulation is going to play an important role here in assuring consumers of the safety of the product. So I'll speak a bit about nomenclature, and this is something you've probably noticed people saying cell-based meat or clean meat or cultured meat or whatever you want to call it. This has been something that's kind of been debated in the space for a little while. At first, in the early days when it was only really scientists interested in this, in vitro meats was the most commonly used term. A few years later, somebody thought that it would be, I think it was Jason Mahaney at New Harvest, who coined the term cultured meat, which was at the time an innovation and more appealing to consumers. Cultured meat sounds sort of a bit more sexy and a bit French. Years later, that was kind of associated with cell cultures, and so some people thought we can probably do a bit better than that again. So in 2016, the Good Food Institute coined the term clean meat. Till a few months ago, that was, so the Good Food Institute also tested those in experiments, where some people read about the product by the name clean meat, some read it by the name cultured meat, and various other names were tested as well. Animal charity evaluators also had a study on that point, and they basically demonstrated that yes, clean meat was more appealing to consumers than the name cultured meat, which in turn was more appealing than names like lab-grown meat, these things which are associated with science. I don't know whose idea it was to highlight the environmental benefits by calling it green meat, but I don't think I'd find that too appealing myself. There, a few months ago, started to be some concerns about the name clean meat. The two most important concerns are basically, number one, that it's not necessarily clear what that actually means. If it's not something that you've heard of before, it's not obvious by saying clean meat, the technology that we're actually talking about, and perhaps it would be a good thing if that was more obvious. And the second is more of a strategic thing. Within the clean meat industry, it's an important thing to get basically conventional meat producers and processors on side. We want the companies who are controlling meat at the moment to be with us rather than against us. And there were some worries that by using the term clean meat, you're kind of implying that conventional meat is dirty and basically going to end up putting off people who we want to have on our team. So for that reason, about 6 months ago, people started to use the term cell-based meat. And that's now quite widely used by many of the cultured meat companies in the States. And the debate continues, basically, around nomenclature, so this is something that's likely to be contested still. The most recent study on the topic looked at consumer appeal and also another couple of names. So again, for those of you who can't see the bottom of the screen, the names tested in this study by the Good Food Institute last year were slaughter-free meat, craft meat, clean meat, cultured meat, and cell-based meat. This is a measure of consumer appeal, and you can see that cell-based meat performed the worst compared to the other names. Slaughter-free meat performed the best here. They also looked at other measures aside from appeal, including descriptiveness, so how intuitively did these terms describe what the product actually is. And you can see that the concerns around clean meat were kind of confirmed here. That was thought to be the least descriptive compared to the other names. Cell-based meat was more descriptive, and slaughter-free meat, again, was the highest on this metric as well. Now, when it came to actual purchase intent, they basically found not very much different between all of the different names. So consumers said that they were differently appealing, but when asked how likely they were to purchase it, there basically wasn't that much difference between the names. Slaughter-free meat, again, was one of the best performing on this metric, and kind of came out the best overall from that study. So I would say that the name slaughter-free meat certainly has some potential. It's clear to consumers what it is, it's appealing, and it results in decent purchase intent. So I'll talk a bit now about some of the messaging around cultured meat and how we can get this right. Firstly, I'll talk about this issue of naturalness. As I mentioned, this is, in consumers' minds, closely linked to food safety. People basically have the intuition that natural equals good and unnatural equals bad. This is something that we call the naturalistic fallacy. It's basically, if you think about that for a little while, it's kind of obviously not true. There's loads of unnatural things which are really good, like modern medicine, and there's also loads of natural things which are really bad, like earthquakes. So really, naturalness bears no relation to the goodness of a thing, but nonetheless, that's the intuition that many people have, particularly around food. A friend of mine said to me that if you're looking on a food label and you see all these additives and ingredients, he says you shouldn't eat anything that you can't pronounce. As I'm going to be bloody hungry when I go to Germany. So we studied a few different ways of addressing this naturalness concern. We were testing out 4 different arguments. In one condition, we argued that clean meat is natural. It resembles the process of cells replicating that you find in nature. In one, we argued that conventional meat is unnatural. They're raised in unnatural conditions. There's antibiotics and hormones and so on. In one, and in my view, this is kind of the true argument, naturalness shouldn't matter. As I mentioned before, there's not necessarily any correlation between naturalness and goodness. And in the 4th condition, we didn't discuss naturalness, and we just talked about the other benefits of clean meat. Now, we didn't find massive differences in consumer appeal with these arguments, but as you might have thought, if people do think that naturalness is important, a certain type of consumer, they're basically not persuaded by the argument that clean meat is natural or that naturalness shouldn't matter. It's quite difficult to persuade people of those things. They actually performed worse than not discussing naturalness at all overall. And the best performing was pointing at the unnatural features of conventional meat. But again, as I said, from a strategic perspective, when we're in this kind of delicate industry where we don't want to be upsetting the conventional meat producers, perhaps this is not a great route to go down. We've also looked at how acceptance differs with various different frames. So the image in the middle here is probably familiar if you've Googled any stories about cultured meat. Very often you'll have these kind of images of labs, people in lab coats, nice big picture of Mark Post holding up a Petri dish. That's very familiar to many of us. And we were comparing this message with this kind of high-tech message with a message emphasizing the societal benefits of clean meat, and also with a message that highlights the similarities to conventional meat. This was basically saying, it's the same product, it's just made in a different way. And as you might expect, the high-tech message resulted in the lowest levels of willingness to eat the product. So this is kind of a problem because a lot of the media coverage that goes on at the moment is focused on this kind of high-tech aspect, and it's very much framed as something that's of the future and perhaps a bit weird and perhaps a bit unknown. There's pretty sub-optimum framing from our perspective, although for the time being at least, that's what's making it newsworthy, so it's possibly difficult to move away from. This roughly replicates what's been found in another study. Here, people saw either a technical or a non-technical description of cultured meat. And reading the non-technical description resulted in higher perceived naturalness, higher willingness to eat, and higher willingness to buy. So the lesson here is that too much focus on the details is off-putting to consumers. This is kind of the same thing with conventional meat, right? Nobody wants to see how the sausage is made with regards to cultured meat or with regards to conventional meat as well. So there's been a handful of studies which compare acceptance across different countries. This one from 2005 is the only one to have looked at all the different European countries. This should be taken with more than a pinch of salt because it's about 15 years old now. And it also didn't ask about willingness to eat cultured meat, but rather support for the concept in general. Should it be allowed to happen? Now, this is a lot of data and slide to take a photo of if you'd like to. You can look for your own countries on this list. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason or rhyme to the order of these countries. We can see the most accepting at the top of the list here being Spain and Italy, which to me was quite a surprise. I would have thought that they're countries that would value tradition in their meat production, but they were actually amongst the most supportive of the concept. And you can see down the bottom, Cyprus, Denmark, Switzerland. So there doesn't seem to be massive differences between the countries or any particular reason why they should be ordered like this. But there we go. The others are a bit more recent and a bit more relevant and a bit more telling. So a study from last year asked consumers in the UK versus consumers in the USA. And if we look back at the last slide, we can see that the UK is kind of nearish the top within the European context, but they're basically all fairly similar. So this is a good comparison of Europe to the US. And they found about twice as many people in the US saying that they would eat it compared to in the UK. Again, about 1 in 5 in the UK said that they would eat it. Now, that's not a bad baseline, but higher acceptance in the States. And then just recently, we've published a study comparing acceptance in the US, where most of this research has been carried out, to the first and second most populous countries in the world, being India and China, exploring those markets as potential. As someone mentioned earlier, these are going to be really where the majority of the growth and demand of meat is coming from, as people moving into the middle class, consuming more meat. We want to see what's the consumer appeal of clean meat in these countries. And we were quite surprised by the results. We actually found much higher acceptance in India and China compared to in the States. Now, there's a fairly big caveat to these results. When you're doing these kind of online studies, you select for people who have access to the internet, which in India and China is disproportionately well-educated, urban center, kind of high-income consumers. And some of those are things that we know correlate with acceptance. However, those are basically the markets that clean meat producers should be interested in. The US sample here was nationally representative. But it is likely that if consumers in India and China have access to clean meat anytime soon, it is going to be those higher income urban consumers. So we found pretty robust willingness to eat clean meat in all of these countries, but really highlighting the surprisingly high level of acceptance in India and China. So there could certainly be opportunities there. So in the future, we're going to be looking at how acceptance might be affected by nutritional enhancements in clean meat. There's the potential to include omega-3 oils and things like this. Will that increase acceptance, or will that exacerbate concerns about unnaturalness and make it seem like an unfamiliar product? We don't know. We're going to find out. How does acceptance vary in different purchase settings? Are people more likely to say that they would eat it in a restaurant as opposed to buying it from a supermarket? What's the acceptance rate of specific products? Should people be going after steaks, or are consumers more open to things which are perhaps more processed already, like sausages, meatballs, that kind of thing? And how can we see acceptance varying over time? Is my thesis that that's generally going to go up going to be correct? We haven't done any kind of longitudinal data on this point yet, so the answer is for now, we don't really know. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Chris. Stay with us for a moment. Do we have any questions on this really awesome and interesting talk? Is there a question back there? I'm going to go running with the microphone. High heel running in slow motion. Where is the question?
What about cultured dairy and eggs? Do we know anything about those?
Yeah, good question. We don't, as far as I know, there's no studies at the moment looking at cultured eggs. But cultured dairy, there was a study last year in the UK by the same pollster who had previously asked about cultured meat. So it's an interesting thing because you can basically compare them directly. There were very similar questions asked of a very similar sample. And they basically found much higher acceptance of cultured dairy compared to cultured meat. We don't quite know why that is, but presumably there's just something less offensive about milk made in this way compared to meat. So perhaps less culturally important. He said, yeah, that could be it. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions over there? Okay. There you go.
Hey, Chris, thanks for a very interesting talk. Just a quick question about the potential interaction between plant-based and cell-based meat. Did you do any, or do you intend to do any research into the relationship between both claims on a single product? In either direction, negative or positive interaction from consumer acceptance point of view?
So the study where we looked at consumers in the US and India and China, we actually asked about plant-based meat in that study as well. And that's, I think, the biggest data set that's available on this question. That was over 3,000 consumers in total. And what we basically saw is that people with higher meat attachment, people who are heavier meat consumers, are much more likely to prefer cultured meat. The cultured meat was always preferable to people with a higher meat attachment, whereas plant-based meat was more catered towards people who are meat reducing. So it looks like they could be catering to their end of the market and won't necessarily be competing with each other in that context. Well, I'm not quite sure if I've answered your question, though.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, a hybrid product. I see. Yeah, no. No is the short answer. We haven't done any research on that I know of.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? There is one over there. Okay. Just hold that mic for you.
Thank you for your sharing. I'm very interested in your survey earlier this year in US, China, and India, right? Yeah, the acceptance of clean meat. Based on your survey in China, the acceptance is high. Just wonder that in the survey, clean meat is there any kind of explanation on what clean meat is to the respondents in China? Because I think if clean is just an adjective, I can understand how most of the Chinese consumers would say yes, but in this case, clean meat is a proper noun, and it's a very new concept in China. Yeah.
Yeah, right, you are. So consumers in all of those countries were given the exact same description, basically an explanation of what clean meat is and what some of the benefits are. We also did, as kind of a pilot to that study, a brief study on what nomenclature should be used in China. This is something that doesn't necessarily translate between different languages, and we already knew that clean meat's a good name in the States, so we wanted to make sure that we were using a relatively good name in China as well. And we basically found pretty similar themes there. People are more attracted to names which are around the theme of clean meat, pure meat, that kind of thing, and less attracted to names which highlight the overly scientific context, lab-grown meats, that kind of thing. But yes, all consumers were given a description of what the product was.
Okay. Okay, I think we're through with questions. I don't see any. Oh, there is. Do we have time to take one more question? Okay, maybe a quick question.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested into the wording, and I think it's very important for the future, but I could imagine that there is quite a big change of the understanding. For example, the concept of nature is, in the German-speaking country, a very strong argument, not so in Great Britain, not so in Spain, and so I think it's very interesting to focus on these different acceptance, thank you.
You're welcome.
Of these different cultural aspects to give a bigger chance for this introduction of a completely new idea of meat production. Thank you. Could you reflect on this? Thank you.
Thank you, honey.
On the theme of naturalness and how that's...
The different cultures, he said.
I see, right, yes. So I don't know so much about how that will differ in Europe, amongst different European countries, but in our study in India and China and the States, we ran regressions in each of those countries to see which kind of attitudinal factors were predicting willingness to buy, and we did find some differences. So in the States, that was highly correlated with the disgust reaction, so it's quite an emotional disgust reaction, which is very commonly discussed in the literature of Western consumers. In China, the biggest drivers of acceptance were basically perceived health and safety. So if there are going to be health benefits, that's going to be particularly important to Chinese consumers. And in India, it was mainly driven by perceived necessity and ethics. So there are kind of different, there seem to be different drivers of acceptance in different cultures, yeah.
Oh, that's very exciting. So I think with that, we'll conclude with this great talk. Once again, big applause to Chris Bryant. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeroen.